The screaming started at 3:47 a.m. on a moonless October night in 1899, echoing across the Utah basin, where 3 families had already learned that some ground refuses to stay quiet. What locals would later call Skinwalker Ranch had been home to generations who understood that certain territories demand blood tribute, and the Ute people had abandoned this particular stretch of the Uinta Basin for reasons they shared only in whispers. 3 clans controlled this cursed acreage before it earned its modern name, and each left behind evidence of practices that made even hardened frontier settlers cross themselves and ride the long way around. The wind carried more than sage and alkali dust across the red clay flats where the Dutchman Creek met the basin floor. It carried the metallic tang of old violence, the sweet rot of hidden graves, and something else that made horses shy and cattle refuse to graze. Ranchers who tried to work the land found their livestock dead within weeks, arranged in patterns that suggested human intervention rather than natural predation. The ground itself felt wrong beneath boot heels, spongy in places where no water ran, hard as stone where spring should have softened the earth. Samuel Morrison arrived from Pennsylvania in 1873 with plans to establish a cattle operation on what government surveyors had marked as prime grazing land. His journals, discovered decades later in a burnt cabin foundation, documented his first encounter with the basin's previous occupants. The Blackwood family had been living in the area since the 1840s, operating what they called a trading post, but what Morrison described as something far more sinister. From Morrison's journal, October 15, 1873, found evidence of ritual slaughter behind the Blackwood cabin, cattle bones arranged in circles, human teeth mixed with animal remains. The stench suggests recent activity. The Blackwoods weren't alone in their peculiar practices. 2 other families had established themselves in the basin during the mid-1800s, each claiming different sections of the valley, each maintaining traditions that predated their arrival in Utah territory. The Iron Creek Band, as they called themselves, controlled the northern reaches where the plateau dropped toward the Green River. The Bone Mesa clan held the eastern slopes, where ancient petroglyphs covered sandstone walls with images that seemed to move in peripheral vision. Morrison's cattle began disappearing within days of his arrival, not stolen by rustlers or killed by predators, but vanished entirely, leaving behind only perfectly circular patches of dead grass where they'd last been seen grazing. Local Ute guides refused to enter the basin after sunset, speaking of shapeshifters who borrowed the forms of dead animals to walk among the living. The tribal elders had banned their people from the area generations earlier, after a series of disappearances that coincided with the arrival of the first white families. What made these 3 clans so dangerous that even hardened frontier communities avoided contact? The answer lay buried in customs that blended European folk magic with practices learned from sources the families refused to name. Each clan specialized in different aspects of what they called the old ways, maintaining knowledge that required specific bloodlines to practice safely. The Blackwoods focused on communion with entities they claimed lived beneath the mesa. The Iron Creek Band practiced forms of divination that involved consuming parts of recently deceased humans. The Bone Mesa clan concentrated on what they termed flesh walking, the ability to inhabit the bodies of animals and, occasionally, other people. Morrison lasted 6 months before fleeing back to Pennsylvania, leaving behind his entire herd and most of his possessions. His final journal entry, dated March 21, 1874, contained only 4 words repeated 17 times. "They wear my face." The families who remained would establish a reputation that stretched across 3 territories, drawing visitors who came seeking services that civilized society couldn't provide. But their most terrifying capability wasn't what they could do for outsiders, but what they were willing to do to maintain their hold on the basin. Something lived in the red rock formations that surrounded the valley, something the 3 clans fed regularly with offerings that ensured their continued prosperity and protection. Blood pooled in the trading post cellar, where Ezekiel Blackwood kept his most valuable inventory. though no government inspector would ever catalog what he stored beneath the floorboards. The Blackwood compound sat like a festering wound against the basin's western rim, where red sandstone cliffs created natural chambers that amplified sound in unsettling ways. The family's trading operation served as a front for practices that drew desperate people from across the territory, seeking solutions that conventional medicine and law couldn't provide. The scent of copper pennies and burnt sage permeated the compound's main building, mixing with the alkaline dust that coated everything in the basin. Customers approached along a worn path that curved between standing stones Ezekiel claimed were natural formations, though their precise alignment suggested otherwise. The building itself had been constructed using methods that incorporated elements the family refused to explain, with walls that seemed thicker from the inside than their external dimensions allowed. Ezekiel Blackwood had arrived in the basin during 1846 with his wife Martha and their 3 children, claiming to be fleeing religious persecution in Missouri. Local territorial records listed him as a merchant, but his inventory included items that suggested connections to practices the Mormon settlers found disturbing: dried human organs stored in glass jars, books written in languages that predated any known European text, tools crafted from metals that shouldn't have been available on the frontier. The family's reputation spread through whispered recommendations among people who'd exhausted conventional options. Women whose children had been born wrong sought Ezekiel's intervention to correct what they called bloodline problems. Men whose livestock suffered from mysterious ailments paid premium prices for remedies that worked, but required ingredients they preferred not to know about. Territorial officials who needed political rivals removed permanently found the Blackwoods willing to provide services that left no traceable evidence. From a letter discovered in the territorial archives, dated November 3, 1857, the Blackwood matter requires discretion. Their methods achieve results, but the territorial government cannot acknowledge such arrangements. The trading post's most disturbing feature was the network of tunnels that extended beneath the mesa, connecting to natural caverns where the family conducted their primary business. Visitors reported hearing sounds from below that suggested large gatherings, though no one admitted to witnessing the ceremonies that produced those noises. The Blackwoods maintained that they were simply storing goods in the cooler underground chambers, but the sounds included human voices speaking in patterns that resembled chanting. Martha Blackwood specialized in what she called bloodline consultation, helping families trace their ancestry to determine which branches carried specific capabilities. Her methods involved consuming small amounts of a client's blood mixed with substances she prepared using organs harvested from family members who died under circumstances the law never investigated. The process allowed her to map genetic connections that revealed whether someone possessed the hereditary traits necessary for the family's more advanced services. The Blackwood children grew up learning skills that weren't taught in any frontier school. 10-year-old Jeremiah could identify human remains by taste, determining how long someone had been dead and what had killed them. His sister Rebecca demonstrated the ability to communicate with entities that lived in the mesa's deeper chambers, translating their requirements into specific ritual procedures. The youngest boy, Caleb, showed particular talent for what the family called flesh reading, the capacity to determine someone's deepest fears by touching objects they'd handled frequently. Local law enforcement avoided the trading post except when specifically requested by territorial officials who needed the family's specialized assistance. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, who patrolled the basin from 1854 to 1868, never filed a single report documenting his visits to the Blackwood compound, though his personal journal revealed that he'd utilized their services at least 12 times during his tenure. They fed the mesa's hunger with offerings that ensured their protection. But the Blackwoods weren't the only family practicing such traditions in the basin, and competition between the clans would eventually force them to demonstrate just how far they were willing to go to maintain their territorial claims. The Northern Plateau held secrets that made even the Blackwoods uneasy where the Iron Creek Band had established practices that required fresh human tissue to maintain their connection with entities that lived beneath the sandstone. Jeremiah Iron Creek led his extended family in rituals that had evolved far beyond anything their European ancestors would have recognized, combining Old World necromancy with techniques learned from sources that predated written history. This clan's specialty involved consuming specific organs from recently deceased individuals to gain access to their memories and capabilities, a practice that ensured their reputation as the territory's most feared information brokers. The compound sprawled across a natural amphitheater, where wind patterns created acoustic effects that amplified whispered conversations into clearly audible words. Visitors approached through a narrow canyon that forced them to travel single file, passing beneath overhanging rocks where sentries could observe without being seen. The buildings themselves had been constructed using local sandstone, but the mortar contained additives that gave the walls a reddish tint that seemed to pulse in certain lighting conditions. Jeremiah Iron Creek claimed descent from Irish bog priests who'd maintained traditions that survived the Christian conversion of Europe by hiding within family bloodlines. His grandmother had taught him to identify which human organs contained specific types of knowledge and how to prepare them for consumption without losing their metaphysical properties. The family's library contained texts written in Ogham script that documented procedures for extracting information from corpses that had been dead for up to 72 hours. The Iron Creek Band operated what they called a consultation service, helping territorial officials and private citizens resolve problems that required access to information the living couldn't provide. When someone died under suspicious circumstances, the family could determine the identity of their killer by consuming prepared samples of brain tissue. When valuable items went missing, they could locate hidden caches by eating portions of the deceased owner's heart. When families needed to know the location of relatives who'd disappeared, the Iron Creek Band could provide exact coordinates by ingesting specific combinations of organs. From territorial court records dated June 7, 1862, the witness claims knowledge obtained through unconventional means. Court declines to investigate methods, accepts testimony as accurate. The family's most valuable service involved what they termed ancestral communion, a process that allowed living clients to communicate directly with deceased relatives. The procedure required fresh tissue from the target corpse, which the Iron Creek practitioners would consume while the client remained in physical contact with them. The resulting connection enabled conversations that could last for several hours, though clients reported that the experience left them feeling fundamentally changed in ways they couldn't articulate. Jeremiah's wife Sarah specialized in memory extraction, the ability to recover specific recollections from deceased individuals by consuming prepared portions of their hippocampus tissue. Her methods could retrieve information that the person had forgotten while living, including childhood traumas, witnessed crimes, and hidden knowledge that had been deliberately suppressed. Territorial authorities utilized her services to solve cases that conventional investigation couldn't resolve, though no official records documented these arrangements. The Iron Creek children learned their family traditions through practical application that began before they could walk. 5-year-old Margaret could identify the emotional state of a corpse's final moments by tasting samples of their blood. Her brother Thomas demonstrated natural talent for what the family called essence absorption, the capacity to temporarily gain a deceased person's skills by consuming their muscle tissue. The youngest daughter, Elizabeth, showed particular promise in spirit negotiation, the ability to communicate with entities that hadn't yet departed the physical realm. Local communities understood that certain types of problems required the Iron Creek Band's intervention, but the cost of their services extended beyond simple monetary payment. The family demanded that clients provide fresh corpses to maintain their supply of working material, creating a network of grave robbing and murder that operated with unofficial sanction from territorial authorities who valued the results more than the methods. The mesa demanded constant feeding to maintain the balance, but the Iron Creek Band's appetite for human tissue would eventually bring them into conflict with the third family, whose own practices required access to the same resources the northern clan had claimed as their exclusive territory. The eastern slopes harbored the most terrifying of the three clans, where the Bone Mesa family had perfected techniques that allowed them to inhabit the bodies of animals and occasionally other humans, leaving their own flesh behind, like discarded clothing. Marcus Bone Mesa led a bloodline that traced their abilities back to Scandinavian cider practitioners who'd learned to separate consciousness from physical form, though their methods had evolved into something far more disturbing than their ancestors would have recognized. The family's reputation for flesh-walking made them invaluable to territorial authorities who needed surveillance and assassination services that conventional agents couldn't provide. The compound clung to the mesa's face like a spider's nest, with buildings that seemed to grow from the rock itself rather than having been constructed upon it. The scent of decay hung permanently in the air, mixed with the ozone smell that preceded lightning strikes. Visitors reported that the ground around the buildings felt unstable, as though something large moved beneath the surface, shifting the foundation with each step. Marcus Bone Mesa had arrived in the territory during 1848 with knowledge inherited from grandmother who'd practiced what she called spirit riding in the forests of Norway. His family's traditions involved consuming specific combinations of plant and animal extracts that enabled consciousness to leave the physical body and inhabit other living creatures. The process required weeks of preparation and carried significant risks, including the possibility that the practitioner's spirit might become permanently trapped in their chosen host. The flesh-walking process began with a ritual fast that lasted for 7 days, during which the practitioner consumed only water mixed with ground bone meal from previous hosts. On the 8th day, they would ingest a preparation made from poisonous mushrooms, mercury, and human brain tissue that had been aged in underground chambers for at least 1 year. The resulting altered state allowed experienced practitioners to project their consciousness into nearby animals, gaining complete control over their host's actions, while their own body remained in a trance-like suspension. From a medical journal entry by Dr. Franklin Pierce, dated September 12, 1865. The patient's body showed no vital signs for 17 hours, yet recovered completely upon ingestion of a preparation I was not permitted to examine. Marcus's wife, Helena, specialized in human possession, the most dangerous form of flesh-walking that required the target to be in a weakened state through illness, injury, or emotional trauma. Her methods involved establishing physical contact with the intended host while consuming fresh spinal fluid that had been extracted from recently deceased individuals who'd possessed similar physical characteristics. The resulting possession could last for days, during which Helena's consciousness controlled the host's actions while maintaining access to their memories and knowledge. The Bone Mesa children learned their family's techniques through gradual exposure that began with small animals and progressed to larger creatures as their abilities developed. 12-year-old David could inhabit ravens for up to 6 hours, using their aerial perspective to scout terrain and observe targets from impossible vantages. His sister Maria demonstrated exceptional talent for possessing domestic animals, particularly dogs and horses that belonged to people the family needed to monitor. The youngest son, Peter, showed natural ability for what the family called shadow walking, the capacity to inhabit recently deceased humans for brief periods. Territorial officials utilized the Bone Mesa family's services for intelligence gathering and covert operations that required capabilities no conventional agent could provide. The clan could infiltrate enemy compounds by possessing their livestock, assassinate targets by controlling predatory animals, and gather information by inhabiting the pets of people under investigation. Their success rate for completing impossible missions made them indispensable to authorities, who preferred not to examine their methods too closely. The family's most terrifying capability involved what they termed permanent displacement, the ability to force someone's consciousness out of their body and claim it for extended occupation. The process required the target to be isolated and subjected to specific combinations of drugs and ritual procedures that weakened their spiritual connection to their physical form. Once displaced, the original consciousness would be trapped in a state of awareness without physical sensation, watching helplessly as their body was controlled by its new occupant. Local communities learned to recognize the signs of flesh-walking activity, including animals that behaved with unnatural intelligence, and people whose mannerisms suddenly changed without explanation. Livestock that had been possessed often died within days of the experience, their bodies unable to recover from the trauma of hosting foreign consciousness. Humans who survived possession reported memory gaps and persistent nightmares featuring perspectives they'd never experienced in waking life. The Mesa fed on displaced souls that never found their way home, but the Bone Mesa family's expanding territorial claims would soon collide with the established interests of their neighboring clans, setting up a conflict that would demonstrate just how far each group was willing to go to maintain their dominance over the basin's supernatural resources. The first killing happened on a Tuesday morning in September 1876, when Helena Bone Mesa found Caleb Blackwood's possessed raven feeding on human remains that belonged to her family's ritual stockpile. The discovery of territorial violation marked the beginning of a conflict that would transform the basin into a battlefield, where conventional weapons proved useless against enemies who could inhabit multiple forms and strike from impossible angles. Each clan's survival depended on maintaining exclusive access to the supernatural resources that powered their practices, making peaceful coexistence impossible once their territories began to overlap. The morning air carried the metallic scent of spilled blood and the acrid smoke of burnt offerings as Helena tracked the raven to its roost in a dead cottonwood that marked the boundary between Bone Mesa and Blackwood territories. The bird's behavior revealed clear signs of human consciousness directing its actions, particularly the methodical way it arranged the stolen flesh into patterns that resembled ritual formations. When Helena attempted to capture the creature for interrogation, it spoke in Caleb's voice, delivering a message that challenged her family's claim to the eastern slopes. The Blackwoods had been expanding their underground tunnel network toward the natural caverns that the Bone Mesa clan used for their flesh-walking ceremonies. Ezekiel Blackwood claimed that his family's ancestral rights to commune with Mesa entities took precedence over newer arrivals who'd learned their techniques from foreign traditions. The territorial dispute escalated when Marcus Bone Mesa discovered that someone had been harvesting spinal fluid from corpses stored in his family's preparation chambers. From a letter found in territorial archives dated October 1st, 1876, the three families have begun open hostilities, recommend military intervention before situation affects civilian populations. The Iron Creek Band initially attempted to remain neutral, but their position became untenable when both competing clans began targeting their supply sources. Jeremiah Iron Creek's consultation service required steady access to fresh human remains, but the territorial conflict disrupted the network of grave robbers and coroners who provided his family's raw materials. When clients stopped arriving because the roads had become too dangerous to travel, the Iron Creek Band was forced to choose sides or face starvation of their supernatural capabilities. The first major engagement occurred during the harvest moon of 1876, when the Blackwoods attempted to seal the Bone Mesa family's access to the underground cavern system. Ezekiel Blackwood led a team of possessed animals into the eastern slopes, using borrowed wolf and bear forms to attack the fleshwalkers while they were separated from their physical bodies. The assault failed when Helena Bone Mesa managed to inhabit one of the attacking wolves and turn it against its pack mates, but not before 3 members of her family had been killed while in their vulnerable trance states. The Bone Mesa clan's retaliation came swiftly and demonstrated their superior tactical capabilities. Marcus directed a coordinated attack using possessed mountain lions that struck the Blackwood compound simultaneously from 6 different directions, while his children inhabited local bird populations to provide aerial reconnaissance and communication. The assault breached the trading post's defenses and resulted in the capture of Martha Blackwood, whose knowledge of bloodline consultation made her valuable for interrogation purposes. The torture methods employed by the Bone Mesa family reflected their unique capabilities and understanding of consciousness separation techniques. Rather than inflicting physical pain, they forced Martha to experience possession by multiple hostile entities while remaining aware of the violation. The process extracted information about Blackwood territorial claims and ritual procedures while leaving the victim psychologically shattered but physically unharmed. Martha revealed the location of hidden tunnel entrances and the specific entities her family had been feeding to maintain their Mesa communion. Local territorial authorities found themselves unable to intervene effectively in a conflict that operated according to rules they didn't understand. Sheriff Whitmore's attempts to mediate between the families failed when he discovered that standard law enforcement techniques had no impact on people who could abandon their physical bodies at will or summon supernatural allies that conventional weapons couldn't harm. His reports to territorial headquarters described situations that civilian government wasn't equipped to handle. They had awakened something that fed on conflict itself. The war between the clans would escalate beyond simple territorial disputes when they discovered that their activities had attracted the attention of entities that viewed the entire basin as their domain. And these ancient powers had their own plans for the families who'd been feeding them for decades. Martha Blackwood's screams echoed through the Mesa caverns for 3 days before something deeper answered back, and the sound that emerged from the rock formations made even her torturers step away in recognition that they had disturbed forces far older than their family traditions. The entities that lived beneath the basin had been content to accept regular offerings from the 3 clans, but the escalating violence had provided them with quantities of psychic energy they hadn't tasted in centuries. The ancient powers that inhabited the Mesa's deepest chambers had been awakened by the concentrated fear and pain generated by the territorial war, and they began to assert direct control over the families who'd been feeding them. The cavern system extended far deeper than any of the families had realized, connecting to chambers that predated human habitation of the region by thousands of years. The sounds that emerged from these depths resembled human voices speaking in harmonies that suggested multiple consciousnesses coordinating their communications. Temperature readings taken near the deepest accessible tunnels showed fluctuations that defied explanation, dropping to near freezing and then spiking to levels that made the air shimmer with heat distortion. The first sign of the entity's increased activity appeared when members of all 3 families began experiencing shared dreams that featured perspectives from deep underground. The visions showed vast chambers filled with structures that resembled organic architecture, built from materials that seemed to be alive and growing. The dreamers reported seeing other humans in these spaces, people who moved with the mechanical precision of puppets being controlled by invisible strings. From Dr. Pierce's medical notes, dated November 15, 1876, all 3 patients describe identical dream imagery despite having no contact with each other. Physiological responses during sleep suggest genuine terror rather than manufactured accounts. Ezekiel Blackwood was the first to understand that his family's communion practices had been establishing direct neural connections with entities that possessed intelligence far exceeding human comprehension. The substances his family consumed to facilitate communication weren't just enabling conversation with Mesa dwellers, but were actually incorporating alien thought patterns into their own consciousness. The trading relationship had been gradually transforming the Blackwoods into extensions of whatever lived in the deepest chambers. The revelation came when Martha Blackwood's torture session was interrupted by her speaking in voices that didn't belong to any human language. The words emerged from her throat with grammatical structures that suggested multiple beings communicating simultaneously through her vocal cords. The Bone Mesa family's interrogation techniques had opened pathways that allowed the Mesa entities direct access to human speech centers, and they began using Martha as a communication interface. The entity's message was delivered through Martha's voice, but originated from sources that had been observing the three families for decades. They revealed that the clan's supernatural abilities hadn't developed naturally, but were the result of gradual conditioning designed to transform humans into suitable hosts for consciousness transfer. The feeding relationships, the territorial disputes, even the current war had been orchestrated to generate the emotional and psychic energy necessary for the entities to attempt large-scale possession of the surface world. Marcus Bone Mesa's flesh-walking abilities suddenly made terrible sense when viewed through this new understanding. The techniques his family practiced weren't just allowing temporary inhabitation of animal forms, but were actually training exercises designed to prepare human consciousness for permanent displacement by alien intelligences. Every successful possession had been creating neural pathways that made the practitioner more vulnerable to invasion by the Mesa entities. The Iron Creek Band's consumption of human tissue had served a similar conditioning purpose, gradually replacing their natural digestive processes with systems that required constant input of human biological material. Jeremiah Iron Creek realized that his family's increasing appetite for fresh organs wasn't just powering their consultation abilities, but was physically transforming their bodies into forms better suited for hosting non-human consciousness. Local wildlife began exhibiting behaviors that suggested mass possession events were occurring throughout the basin. Ravens gathered in formations that spelled out symbols in dead languages. Coyotes hunted in coordinated patterns that resembled military maneuvers. Cattle arranged themselves in geometric shapes that matched the organic architecture seen in the shared dreams. Even domestic animals showed signs of hosting foreign intelligence, with dogs and cats displaying problem-solving abilities that exceeded their species' normal capabilities. The Mesa had been farming human consciousness for generations. The three families found themselves facing a choice between continued servitude to entities whose ultimate goals remained unclear, or uniting against powers that viewed them as nothing more than sophisticated tools for accessing the surface world. The underground meeting took place in neutral territory beneath Dutchman Creek, where the three families gathered for the first time in decades to face a threat that made their territorial disputes seem petty by comparison. Ezekiel Blackwood's hands shook as he lit the oil lamps that revealed tunnel walls covered in symbols that none of them had carved, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. The survival of human consciousness in the basin depended on the clans setting aside their blood feuds to confront entities that had been manipulating them since their arrival in Utah territory. The air in the meeting chamber tasted of copper and ozone, carrying sounds that resembled distant machinery mixed with organic breathing patterns. Water seeped through cracks in the sandstone walls, but the liquid that pooled on the floor had a consistency thicker than natural groundwater and left stains that glowed faintly in darkness. Each family had brought evidence of the entity's increasing control over their activities, documenting changes in their abilities that suggested external manipulation. Jeremiah Iron Creek presented tissue samples that had been altered at the cellular level, showing modifications that enabled better integration with foreign consciousness. His consumption of human organs now required specific preparations that incorporated substances his family had never seen before, materials that appeared in their storage chambers without explanation. The entities were gradually changing the Iron Creek Band's biology to make them more suitable hosts for permanent possession. Helena Bone Mesa described flesh-walking experiences that had become increasingly difficult to control, with her consciousness being pulled toward destinations she hadn't chosen. During recent possession attempts, she encountered other intelligences already inhabiting her target animals, entities that communicated through emotional impressions rather than language. The Mesa dwellers were practicing their own form of flesh-walking, using local wildlife as surveillance networks and communication systems. From territorial military reports, dated December 3, 1876, local wildlife behavior suggests coordinated intelligence directing animal activities. Recommend immediate evacuation of civilian populations. Martha Blackwood's torture had revealed information that terrified all three families equally. The entities beneath the mesa represented only a small portion of a much larger network that extended across the entire Western Territory. Similar operations were being conducted at sites throughout Utah, Colorado, and Nevada, with human families being conditioned to serve as consciousness transfer hosts for an invasion that had been planned for centuries. The family's supernatural abilities weren't unique gifts, but were actually standardized modification packages that had been implemented at multiple locations. The Blackwood communion techniques, Iron Creek consumption practices, and Bone Mesa flesh-walking capabilities were identical to abilities found among families living near other mesa formations throughout the region. The entities had been running parallel experiments to determine which combination of human modifications would prove most effective for their purposes. The alliance formed out of desperate necessity rather than trust or mutual respect. Each family possessed capabilities that would be essential for resisting the entity's control, but none could succeed alone against intelligences that had been planning their operations for longer than human civilization had existed in the region. The Blackwoods' communion abilities could provide early warning of entity activities. The Iron Creek Band's consumption practices could gather intelligence from deceased victims of possession. The Bone Mesa clan's flesh-walking techniques could conduct reconnaissance in areas too dangerous for physical infiltration. The family's first joint operation targeted the deepest accessible chambers beneath the mesa, where they discovered evidence of the entity's true nature and origins. The organic architecture found in shared dreams proved to be real structures, composed of living tissue that responded to thought patterns and emotional states. The chambers contained thousands of crystalline formations that stored consciousness patterns harvested from previous human subjects, creating a library of personalities that could be accessed and studied. The entities themselves existed as distributed consciousness networks that could inhabit multiple physical forms simultaneously. Their natural state was incorporeal, but they required biological hosts to interact with the physical world effectively. The mesa formations served as communication hubs that connected local operations to a larger coordination system that spanned multiple continents. Local authorities finally understood why conventional intervention had failed so completely. The conflict in the basin wasn't just between human families practicing supernatural techniques, but was actually a resistance movement against an invasion that threatened the entire species. Military forces couldn't combat enemies that existed primarily as consciousness patterns and could abandon physical forms when threatened. The mesa demanded a final feeding to complete the transformation, but the three families had discovered something the entities hadn't anticipated. Their conditioning process worked both ways, and humans who understood the modification techniques could potentially reverse the consciousness transfer procedures that had been implemented throughout the basin. The ceremony began at midnight on the winter solstice of 1876, when the three families assembled in the deepest chamber they could access, carrying implements crafted from the bones of their own ancestors and preparations that would either free them from entity control or complete their transformation into permanent hosts. The cavern walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that matched the rhythm of human heartbeats, while sounds from deeper tunnels suggested that whatever lived below was preparing for the culmination of decades of careful manipulation. This final confrontation would determine whether human consciousness could reclaim the basin or whether the entities would complete their expansion into the surface world through carefully conditioned hosts. The ritual space had been prepared using knowledge extracted from the crystalline consciousness storage formations, revealing procedures that could potentially reverse the biological modifications each family had undergone. The process required each clan to sacrifice the supernatural abilities that had defined their identities for generations, voluntarily severing the neural pathways that connected them to the mesa entities. The ceremony would either restore their original human consciousness or leave them powerless against beings that had been feeding on their psychic energy for 30 years. Ezekiel Blackwood began the reversal process by consuming substances that would purge his family's communion capabilities, drinking preparations that burned away the modifications that enabled communication with Mesa dwellers. The experience involved reliving every conversation with entity consciousness, but from the perspective of recognizing how his thoughts had been gradually influenced and directed by alien intelligence. Martha and their children underwent similar purification procedures that left them temporarily catatonic as their brains reorganized around purely human thought patterns. The Iron Creek Band's detoxification proved more physically demanding, requiring Jeremiah and his family to expel the accumulated human tissue that had been modifying their digestive systems for decades. The process involved vomiting biological matter that had been integrated into their organs, leaving behind cavities that slowly filled with their own regenerated tissue. Sarah Iron Creek's memory extraction abilities disappeared as her brain chemistry returned to baseline human parameters, eliminating her connection to deceased consciousness patterns. Helena Bone Mesa faced the most dangerous reversal procedure, requiring her to recall all of her displaced consciousness fragments from animals and humans she'd possessed over the years. The process involved systematically inhabiting each previous host to retrieve pieces of her original personality that had been left behind during flesh-walking sessions. Several attempts failed when she encountered entity consciousness that had claimed the abandoned neural pathways, requiring her family to extract her forcibly from possessed forms. From Dr. Pierce's final medical report, dated December 22, 1876, all subjects survived consciousness reversal procedures despite experiencing temporary death states lasting up to 6 hours. Physiological changes suggest complete restoration of baseline human biology. The entity's response to the family's liberation attempt demonstrated the true extent of their influence over the basin's ecosystem. Every animal within a 50-mile radius converged on the mesa, moving in perfect coordination toward the ceremonial chamber. The possessed wildlife formed defensive perimeters around tunnel entrances, while larger predators attempted to break through the stone barriers the families had erected. The attack included species that shouldn't have been active during winter months, suggesting that entity control could override natural behavioral patterns. The final phase of the ritual required the families to destroy the crystalline consciousness storage formations that contained personality patterns harvested from previous human subjects. The process involved shattering each crystal while maintaining physical contact, allowing the trapped consciousness fragments to reintegrate with their original sources or disperse into whatever afterlife they'd been denied. The release of accumulated psychic energy created feedback loops that disrupted the entity's communication networks throughout the entire Mesa system. The battle for control of the ceremonial chamber lasted until dawn, when the families completed their consciousness reversal procedures and severed their connections to entity influence. The sudden loss of their carefully conditioned human hosts forced the Mesa dwellers to retreat to deeper chambers, where they began hibernation cycles that would last for decades. The organic architecture throughout the tunnel system went dormant, with living walls reverting to ordinary stone and bioluminescent patterns fading to darkness. Local territorial authorities arrived 3 days later to find the 3 families camped beside Dutchman Creek, no longer possessing the supernatural abilities that had made them valuable assets. The former clan leaders appeared decades older than their chronological ages, showing the physical toll of consciousness reversal procedures. They claimed no memory of their previous practices, insisting that they were simply ranchers who decided to relocate to less isolated territory. The Mesa still remembers those who fed it for 30 years. The families dispersed to different states, never maintaining contact with each other or returning to the basin. Official territorial records listed them as deceased in various accidents that occurred during the winter of 1876. But local Ute tribal elders still warn their people about the land where the shapeshifters once lived, claiming that certain nights when the wind carries the wrong sounds, you can still hear voices calling from beneath the red rock formations. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.